This is Dr. Bafano with another lecture on Middle East politics. This is going to be my 27th lecture in this series. Today, we're going to talk about the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran and the effects this has had on the country, as well as other countries in the region, as well as general impact on world politics. So, very important case study. I recommend watching not only all my previous lectures, but the last lecture on the Iranian Revolution. That will help you understand this discussion today. Now, I also highly recommend to like and subscribe. I want to really, get a larger number of viewers, and I want people to not only watch these lectures but engage, ask any questions that you have. If you have any criticism or comments, I like to have discussions with people. Anyway, let's get to it. Let me share my screen with you, and I'm going to put up my PowerPoint here. All right, here it is. All right, so last lecture, we left off on the causes of the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979. In that year, a Western-backed monarchy, the Pahlavi monarchy, led by Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, was overthrown in a revolution. In this revolution, there were Islamists, liberals, social democrats, and communists who, while they had very different views on the world, the one thing they had in common is they wanted the Shah to go. They wanted the monarchy to go. There was a lot of mass anger against the United States for supporting this very oppressive monarchy. The Islamists didn't like the monarchy because of its secular policies. The liberals didn't like it because of its authoritarianism. The social democrats and communists hated it because of the capitalist policies of the regime and the great inequalities in wealth between rich and poor in Iran. So there's lots of mass anger. In 1979, this mass revolution breaks out, and the Shah is forced to flee the country. Highly recommend watching this video below just to kind of help bring this revolution alive. But the masses took to the streets, and by the end of this year, great changes are going to come to this country. So, what happened in the aftermath of the revolution? After the Shah fled, there was going to be a struggle between the Islamists who support Sharia law, the mixing of religion and politics, and those who were more secular, those who supported liberalism, socialism. And eventually, it's the Islamists who are going to win out. And the Islamists were led by the Grand Ayatollah, the head of the Shia Muslim religious clergy. His name was Ayatollah Khomeini. So Khomeini's faction won control of the revolution. And there's a couple of ironies to all of this. You see, under the previous monarchy, with US help, the monarchs severely repressed the left in Iran. They repressed the communists, they repressed the socialists, they even repressed liberals very severely. And because of this, by the time we get to 1979, the left had been seriously hurt politically. And thus, the Islamists had an advantage here. Now, on top of that, Khomeini was a martyr. He was sent into exile as well by the regime. And when he returned to Iran in 1979, this really helped increase the support for Islamism in the country. And eventually, he is going to win control of the revolution. His faction is going to eventually dominate the states. In 1979, by the end of that year, he is going to really become the supreme ruler of this country. And he's going to declare something called an Islamic Republic. A new constitution is going to be created. And in the process, there's going to be a referendum, and the majority of the Iranian people are going to vote in favor of it. So we're going to get what's called a hybrid system here, a system that mixes a theocracy with a republic. You're going to learn all about what this regime was about in a second here, okay? But to put it simply, we are going to see the mix of a republic, that is a system that divides power between three branches of government, a legislative, executive, and judicial branch, and a theocracy where religious elites rule, where the religious clerics rule. All right, so a theocracy is government ruled by religious officials. So let's take a quick look at how this system worked here, just so we can understand more about it. This is how the Islamic Republic of Iran works today. So in 1979, the religious clerics are going to take over the state. Now, part of the system is based on a republic. Now, you might ask, why would these religious clerics create a system that is partially based on this kind of Western model of a republic, right? So a republic was initially created in the Roman Republic, right? So over 2,000 years ago. Eventually, the United States, back in the late 18th century, would adopt this as their form of government and would spread to other countries throughout the world in the ensuing 2 centuries. And the way a republic works is it divides power between three branches of government, as you can see here. Now, why did the Islamists choose to have a government that was part republic? Well, part of the reason is that they wanted to co-opt some of the moderates and some of the left wingers into this system. Okay, there were many people in Iran that supported democratization. They wanted competitive elections. They wanted a republic to be established, just like the Arab republics and the Turkish Republic in the Middle East, right? So they wanted to adapt something that was democratic in nature. So they were hoping that by creating something that was part republic, they could get some of the moderates on board. In fact, even many Islamists wanted to transition to democracy here. So the idea of this was to try to get some of those people on board that were not in favor of a full theocracy. Okay, so we can see here in the Iranian system how it is part republic. So, for one, there is a legislative branch, and they call this legislative branch the Mejlis, just like in other parts of the Middle East. It's a unicameral legislature, which means there is one house with 290 elected representatives in single member districts. So, just like the United States, there is an elected Congress here, an elected legislature. And just like the United States, the job of the legislature is to write the country's laws. So every 4 years, people go to the voting booth, they'll elect a representative from their district, and those representatives will then, once they form a new government, they will write laws for the country. Very much like a republic, right? Then we have the executive branch. Every 4 years, a president is elected. And once that president is elected, they form a cabinet. Today, it has 22 ministers, and there are cabinet positions that deal with foreign policy, that deal with collecting taxes, running the educational system, with building roads and bridges, and so on and so forth, right? So, just like a typical executive branch, the president enforces laws here, okay? And finally, there's a judicial branch with a court system, right, that interprets the law. Just like in the United States, there are criminal and civil courts that put people on trial if they break criminal laws and deal with things like lawsuits and disputes between citizens and society in the civil courts. There is also a court of appeals within this system. So if you get found guilty, you can appeal your sentence. And there is a Supreme Court, which is the final court of appeals. And they also, in fact, even have judicial review in this system. Now, you might be looking at the right side of your chart and thinking, well, this looks a lot like the United States here. Kind of ironic, since this regime is going to become very heavily anti-American and anti-United States. It also looks a lot like the structure of the Arab republics we talked about earlier in the semester, established in Egypt under Gamal Abdel Nasser in the 1950s, what got established in Tunisia, Iraq, Syria, Yemen. So we've got, just like the Arab republics, we get an Iranian republic here, right? So established on a similar basis. This is also what the Turkish Republic looked like in Ataturk, under Ataturk's rule, established in 1923. So we have part Republican system. Now, this is the big however. Take a look at the left side of this chart. While Iran is part republic, it is also part theocracy. So the way the system works is that who can run for office and the legislation that can be created is heavily regulated by the religious clerics, by the religious clergy, and specifically the supreme leader, the Grand Ayatollah of Iran, the head of the Shia religious clergy. Now, the supreme leader is the head of the theocratic part of this system. They are chosen by an assembly of religious experts, 88 elected members of the Shia clergy. So they have to be religious experts trained in religious schools, trained within Sharia law to enforce Islamic law. And the supreme leader, once he's elected, he serves for life. And yes, it has to be a male, it has to be someone who is a religious cleric. Okay, now the supreme leader is incredibly powerful. They have a lot of different ways to shape the political system. Number one, you cannot run for president of the republic without being vetted by the supreme leader. In other words, the supreme leader has to decide if you are Islamist enough. If they decide that you are not religious enough, if you are not Islamist enough, in other words, if you don't support the mixing of religion and states, they could deny your candidacy for the presidency. Okay, so they're only going to allow those that are A, significantly religious, and B, those who support this religious system of government. Okay, so that's one way to control the system. Number two, once the president does get elected, their cabinet picks have to be approved by the supreme leader. So all the heads of the bureaucracies have to be significantly religious enough. Number three, the president does nominate judges and they have to be approved by the legislature. But all of those cabinet picks are once again vetted by the supreme leader. You cannot serve on the courts without being approved by the supreme leader himself. Now, on top of this, the supreme leader as well has other controls on the system. The supreme leader directly controls the military. It's not the president that controls the military, it is the supreme leader. And there's a special branch of the military called the Revolutionary Guard that I'm going to talk about in more detail in a second, that has a lot of powers over domestic and foreign policy, as you're going to find out in a second. Furthermore, all media outlets, before they form, have to be vetted by the supreme leader. You cannot form a newspaper, you cannot form a television station, you cannot at all form a media outlet without the approval of the supreme leader. Now, the idea for this system was founded by Ayatollah Khomeini's ideology. He preached this idea that the religious clerics should rule the state. So this is a way to have a republic as well as a theocracy at the same time here. Ayatollah Khomeini, he called this in Persian, Velayat al-Faqih. That is the rule of those who interpret the religious texts. Okay, so he would be the supreme leader for the first 10 years of this Islamic Republic. And then when he died, his successor, Ayatollah Khamenei, very similar name to different people, he would rule the country starting in 1989, and he is still the supreme leader of the country. Now, just to add to this, the supreme leader also controls the legislature through something called the Guardian Council. Now, the Guardian Council consists of 12 individuals. 6 are directly appointed by the supreme leader himself, and 6 are appointed by the judiciary, specifically by the Supreme Court. And of course, since the supreme leader controls who's on the Supreme Court, he is effectively controlling everybody that sits on the Guardian Council. And what do they do, this Guardian Council? For one, they vet all candidates for the legislature. So the reason for the need of the Guardian Council is that there's a lot of people, 290, that serve on the legislature. So you have a bunch of religious clerics that help the supreme leader rule over this country. On top of that, any legislation that is passed by the legislative branch has to first be vetted by the Guardian Council. They have to determine, does it follow Sharia law? So as we learned in a prior lecture, Sharia law is law that is based on the Islamic faith. The Quran, that is the revelations that Muslims believe God gave to the Prophet Muhammad. as well as the Hadith, the sayings and doings of the Prophet Muhammad and his companions. And in Shia Islam, part of the Hadith as well is constructed from Muhammad's 12 political successors, his family lineage. Okay, so his cousin Ali and their successors. So that is where Sharia law for Shia Muslims come from. And if it doesn't fit within Islamic norms, particularly its very patriarchal norms that has male dominance, that piece of law is not going to be legalized. So the Guardian Council vets all legislation from the legislative branch, and thus all three branches of the republic are regulated by the theocratic side of the equation here. So that's how we have a theocracy mixed with a republic. Now, in Iran, there are competitive elections every 4 years. Multiple political parties do run, but the parties are ranged from moderate Islamists to extremists. Okay. Some who are very lightly critical of the supreme leader to those who are very obedient of the regime. And because there isn't really ideological diversity here, you don't have strong political parties with deep ideological ties to the public. The liberals, the communists, they are banned from running candidates because of the way the system works. And thus, the parties themselves, they tend to be more parties of personality run by individuals as opposed to parties with deep ideological commitments, right? So if you want to run for office in Iran, you have to be an Islamist. Now, if there's any disputes, by the way, between the legislative branch and the Guardian Council, there's also something called the Expediency Council that will try to reshape the laws to make sure they comply with Sharia. And it consists of members of the Guardian Council as well as the Supreme Leader and the President. They try to work out legislation so that it conforms to Sharia law. All right, so that's how our system works here. Now, once Khomeini created the system, he justified it on the basis that Iran has to return to his Islamic roots. Under the prior regime, under the monarch, it was a very secular monarchy. You know, women would go outside without the hijab often. Women went to classes with men. Women, they served in both public and private positions within the economy. But under the supreme leader, there is going to be a shift to a much more conservative regime led by religious officials. Okay, so that was a big change here. Now, in the process, not only is Khomeini going to control the political system, he is also going to control the security apparatus. Okay, and he's going to create something called the Revolutionary Guard. Since Khomeini did not trust the prior monarchy's military, he's going to create a new military here. And this Revolutionary Guard is going to have two major branches. The first major branch is still known as the Basij. This is a militia that polices the population domestically. Number one, okay, after this revolution, they began to hunt down the Shah's supporters, the monarch's supporters, as well as liberals and communists. They began to hang many of these people in public squares. Many were in prison. Many others were forced into exile. So very violent regime here at its beginnings, right? They start to purge all of society of of liberals and communists here. And on top of that as well, the Basij went around enforcing traditional Islamic norms. They began to shut down bars and clubs. They began to force women to wear the hijab. If they saw a woman not dressed properly, they would often arrest them. Sometimes they would beat them. Sometimes it would just give them a warning. But at the end of the day, the effect of this was to enforce traditional Islamic norms. In fact, sometimes they would even do house searches, making sure there was no alcohol in people's homes, making sure people were not throwing parties in their homes. They would also as well crack down on music, Western styles of music. So this regime was quite oppressive of the culture. Now, on top of that, they also as well began to try to spread their revolution abroad to other countries. What the regime created was something known as the Quds Force, run by the Revolutionary Guard. Quds is the Arabic term for Jerusalem. This force was responsible for spreading the Islamic Revolution to other countries. They began to give support to other Islamists, particularly Shia Islamists in other countries like Lebanon, Iran, Yemen, and elsewhere. In fact, in Lebanon, they established Hezbollah in 1982. We learned about this in a prior lecture. So they began to give a lot of arms and funding to other groups out there, and the Revolutionary Guard began to operate abroad, okay, in many other countries, spreading its version of Islamism. And so this is how this complicated system works. You have on one side of the equation, right, the republic with the president, with the Mejlis, and with the judiciary. And on the other side, we have the supreme leader with the Guardian Council, with the Revolutionary Guard. And on top of that as well, of course, they began to give far more funding to mosques, religious schools. They shut down the secular universities and transformed them into religious universities. They prevented men and women from going to the same school. They transformed the media and the justice system here to comply with Sharia law. So what was created is very complex and very conservative political system. And these were our religious leaders here, the first being Ayatollah Khamenei. You can see him on the left here. He's got a very long beard, indicating a very conservative Muslim. He's wearing the, as you can see here, the turban. This is often worn by religious clerics, dressed in a very conservative way. We have here Ayatollah Khamenei, his successor, once again, dressed in a similar way as well. Now, this regime, along with being a theocracy with a Republican facade, was also deeply, deeply anti-United States. In the midst of this revolution in November of 1979, a group of young students stormed the U.S. embassy. Iranian protesters took American hostages in the process. It was known as the hostage crisis of 1979. Now, why did they storm the American embassy? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, it was the CIA in 1953 that helped overthrow a democratically elected government and reestablished the Pahlavi monarchy, which ruled Iran in a very oppressive way for the next 26 years. And the U.S. gave support to this Iranian regime. They also promoted capitalism in Iran. And as a consequence, there was a huge wealth gap between rich and poor. And on top of that, they gave the monarch access to arms, and those arms were used to severely repress the Iranian population. There was mass anger towards the United States, and thus the embassy got stormed. And when it happened, the Ayatollah decided to support the protesters. And this hostage crisis as well radicalized the Iranian government. It created an us versus them situation where they had this conflict with the United States. Now, on top of this, the United States as well was allowing the Shah to stay in America. He was actually getting cancer treatment at the time, and thus there was a lot of anger over this fact that they were not handing the Shah over to the Iranian government. So the embassy was stormed, and over 50 hostages were taken. Now, by doing this, Iran goes from a pro-Western, pro-capitalist monarchy to an anti-Western theocracy. And this made the United States an enemy of the regime here. In fact, it is still an enemy of the United States until this very day. Now, while most Americans from the late 1970s to the present were aware of this hostage crisis, most Americans were not aware of that 1953 military coup or the reasons why so many Iranians have problems with the United States. So it's important to keep in mind to understand the nuances of this history. So as a consequence of all this, we see the emergence of a lot of anti-Western sentiment in Iran. And so many of the protesters during the revolution chanted death to America or down with the United States. They were also deeply anti-Israel as well, because this was a Islamist regime. And so they often chanted death to Israel, down with the Israeli state. In fact, Starting in 1987, Iran is going to give funding and support to Hamas, okay, because they were engaging in this conflict with the Israeli states from that time forward. So we get here a lot of anti-Western, a lot of anti-Israeli sentiments. And of course, in the United States, we begin to see the emergence of a lot of Islamophobia and a lot of anti-Iranian sentiments. Now, due to this revolution, there was also, as well, a great spike in oil prices. Iran is a rentier state. About 60% of the economy is dependent on oil. When the revolution happened, there was a rise in oil prices because of a slowdown in the exports of oil from this country. This led to a lot of economic problems throughout the world, including in the United States in 1979. Oil prices rose rapidly, and there rose a lot of anti-Iranian sentiment within the United States going forward after this. So, in fact, the hostage crisis, because it was this daily thing that it was over, of course, well over a year it took place, it was on the news every day, and it reinforced these anti-Iranian sentiments in the United States that still persist till the present. Now, on top of that, what ended up happening is that a lot of liberals and a lot of left wingers are going to end up fleeing Iran. Over 7 million people within the upper middle class, those who supported liberalism, communism, socialism, they're going to leave the United States. And many of them are going to go to the United States, Germany, Canada, Sweden, the United Kingdom, as you can see on this chart here. And while at first the Iranian regime did try to prevent some of these people from fleeing, eventually they're going to decide to let a lot of these people go. It was a nice way to get rid of the left-wing opposition. And as they go to places like the United States, these refugees are going to oppose the Iranian state from exile. And they're actually going to lobby the United States to actually take a hardline stance with this Islamist regime. This is kind of like what happened in Cuba in the late 1950s when a lot of middle class individuals fled Cuba and went to the United States. So very similar dynamics here. So we have many people living in exile in Europe and the United States from Iran as a consequence of this. What has happened in Iran since then? Well, with public policy, the Iranian regime wanted to build a mass base of support. So one of the things that Iran's Islamic Republic did is they began to spend a lot more on social welfare, on healthcare spending, educational spending, on redistributing wealth to the poor, right? So they're going to create a much larger welfare state than what existed under the Shah, under the monarchy. In fact, per capita, Iran created one of the strongest welfare states in the region. Now, as you're going to find out, there's going to emerge a lot of problems with this welfare state. One, because a lot of the money that could have been used for the welfare state is going to be used with the Iran-Iraq war. It's also going to be lost due to sanctions placed by the United States and Iran's support of a lot of these proxy militias in other parts of the region. But starting in 1979, we are going to see the expansion of Iran's welfare state. And thus, it's going to become popular with this regime with a lot of the rural and urban poor within the country. So we begin to see the expansion of public spending on welfare programs here. Now, on top of this, this regime is going to become popular with conservative rural folk because of its enforcement of conservative Islamic norms. Sharia law is going to be established here. There is going to be, for example, the enforcement of patriarchal norms. There is going to be a crackdown on women's rights here. Okay, we're going to see the reestablishment of Sharia norms. So, for example, women are going to only receive half the inheritance of men. Women, their testimony in a court of law is only going to be half of men. Women are not going to be able to go outside without dressing very conservatively, for example. So women's rights are going to be curtailed. Politics is going to be heavily dominated by men going forward after this. And so as a consequence of all these reforms, the Islamic Republic is going to develop a very large base of support amongst religious conservatives and rural and urban poor folk throughout the country. So lots of people, even till this very day, continue to support the Islamic Republic of Iran within the country. However, and this is the big however, there are a lot of opponents to the regime. And I have to emphasize here, Iran is not just a country socially that has Islamists. There are also liberals, there are social democrats, there are communists in this country. And this opposition comes mainly from the urban middle class, those who received a good education, a secular education under the Shah, and would influence their children. And some of their children would go abroad and then come back to the country, right? So the urban middle class heavily opposes this regime. Furthermore, many of the minorities, some of the religious minorities, the Christians, the Zoroastrian minorities, if you want to know who Zoroastrians are, go watch my prior lecture of mine on the people of the book. They're going to heavily oppose this regime, as are peoples who speak a different language, who don't speak the main language, Farsi. So, for example, there's a lot of opposition from the Kurds, the Turkish-speaking Azeris, for example, in the Northeast. There is going to be some opposition to this regime here. Okay. Now, part of this opposition is not only due to the fact that an Islamic Republic with these conservative norms were established, but because liberal socialist and communist parties are going to be effectively banned, as are liberal socialist and communist media outlets. And this is going to lead to a lot of mass anger, and the regime is going to have to use a lot of violence to oppress these folks. Lots of people are going to be thrown in prison, or they're going to be forced into exile. And periodically, we are going to see periods of mass protests emerge against this regime. In 1999, 2009, 2017, 21, and 2023, mass protests broke out. Some of these protesters supported rights for women, supporting democracy, supporting the rights of ethnic and religious minorities, supporting as well better relations with the West and opening up the political system. Now, in order to deal with these protests, the regime often relied on a mix of oppression, so throwing people in prison, but sometimes co-optation. Sometimes they would allow in elections more moderate Islamists or those in the center to win more seats in the legislature as a way to kind of co-opt some of these folks here and to get them off the streets. So there was a lot of brave women, by the way, that really, took it to the streets in order to protest these reforms. One great example of this was the Green Movement of 2009, in which a lot of liberals, a lot of women's rights activists and feminists took to the streets. And particularly with women's rights, this has been a big movement because they gained a lot of rights under the Shah before 1979. And to see those rights taken away from them was really devastating for a lot of people. And so, unfortunately, though, there's been a lot of violence against these protesters in order to try to repress this movement. And, the question is how long could this regime last, given a lot of opposition that exists within the urban centers in this country? And of course, some of this opposition has come from exile. A great example of this is Marjane Satrapi, her book Persepolis. It was written on, it's this graphic novel that is kind of loosely based off her own personal experience and that of her friends and family growing up during the Islamic Revolution. What's really great about the book is it shows her experience as someone from the upper middle class who had a family that was very left-wing, that was influenced by communism and social democracy. How really they were influenced by this revolution. For one, she herself grew up being used to being able to go out into the streets without an hijab. She grew up with a lot of Western cultural norms. She listened to Western music. She listened to punk music. She listened to heavy metal. She listened to rock music. She liked listened to Michael Jackson and the Beatles, for example. So she had all these different musical styles she was influenced by. Her family members as well made frequent trips to the West, to places in Europe, for example. So she was highly influenced by Western norms. Now, at the same time, though, her family didn't like the Shah. They didn't like the monarchy because of the heavy oppression of the communists. In fact, her family supported the revolution in 1979. And because she was a little girl and her main influences were just her immediate family and friends in her upper middle class neighborhood, she thought that the winners of this revolution were going to be the left. But to her shock and surprise, and the surprise of her own family members, it was the Islamists that went out in this revolution. And of course, her family is going to be very much against the Islamic Republic, and she's going to do various things as a young adolescent to resist the Islamic Republic. She is going to, for example, smoke. She's going to drink behind closed doors, drink alcohol. Her and her family are going to hold parties behind closed doors. She is going to, at school, frequently speak out against her teachers. She's actually going to get expelled. She's going to be a bit of a rebel. This is a way to kind of try to resist the growing oppression of her autonomy within Iranian society. And, at a certain point, she even loses her faith in God here. So it's kind of really this tragic story that she goes through. But what happens over time is the Iranian regime increases its oppression. Right. They, in fact, make several surprise inspections of her home. Some of her family members and friends get arrested and thrown in prison. And eventually her family decides that it's not safe enough for her to stay within the country. So they decide to send her abroad to Austria to go and get an education. And this was really traumatic for her, living through this kind of experience. In fact, while in Austria, she, experiences problems with isolation. She experiences problems with a lot of Islamophobia and racism, and she experiences an identity crisis. In Iran, a lot of people thought of her as Western, but in Austria, a lot of people think of her as Iranian. And so, is she Westernized? Is she Iranian? Is she a Muslim? Is she secular? She goes through this crisis. And in fact, she eventually engages in some drug use. She becomes homeless at one point. Eventually she rebounds. She, gets off the drugs, and she actually returns to Iran in the late 80s. And when she returns, she finds a country that is so different. She finds a country that's much more conservative. Many of the young people that grew up after the Islamic Revolution, much more conservative, and she was shocked by this. And eventually she's going to make a permanent decision to leave Iran again, and she's going to go to France, where she published this book that's really a beautiful graphic novel, but very controversial because it's going to be heavily critical of the Islamic Republic and its conservative norms. And it's going to eventually be made into a movie, and many Islamists are actually going to protest this film. So it became really a source of controversy within the region, this book. An example of how a lot of activists from abroad criticized this regime. But even from within the regime, we see a lot of protest, a lot of brave men and women just going out in the streets to protest this regime. Now, of course, from the perspective of the Islamic Republic, they experienced years of oppression under this very brutal Western-backed monarchy. So from their perspective, they felt like the West was trying to destroy their culture and their way of life, destroy the Islamic faith there. So very controversial what has been happening in Iran here. Now, one last thing about Iran here that's important. Foreign policy. Okay. Iran sees itself not only as engaging in a revolutionary struggle at home to enforce conservative Islamic norms on the population, banning alcohol, banning the hijab, enforcing conservative norms. They are also encouraging an Islamist, and specifically a Shia Islamist, revolt in the rest of the Middle East. By the way, if you don't remember what Shiism is, watch my prior lecture on the Sunni Shia divide in Islam. So, for example, in 1982, during the Lebanese Civil War, Iran and the Revolutionary Guard set up a Shia Islamist militia called Hezbollah. And they would give not only arms to Hezbollah, but a lot of financing. And Hezbollah today has schools, hospitals in southern Lebanon. So in 1982, they established this proxy movement, and they would engage not only in violence with Sunni militias and Christian militias within Lebanon, but with the Israeli state as well, which was occupying southern Lebanon at this time. And they would continue to fight the Israeli state even after Israel would leave in 2000. And so Hezbollah has been engaged in the struggle with the Israeli state, and they are a proxy of Iran, receiving a lot of support and funding there. Now, on top of that as well, Iran heavily encouraged a Shia revolt in the country of Iraq. Now, Iraq, its neighbor, is an Arabic speaking country, at least two-thirds are. They also have a Kurdish minority. Now, on top of that, Muslims in Iraq are divided between Sunni and Shia. The far north of the country consists of Sunni Kurds, the center of the country consists of Sunni Arabs, and the south mainly Shia Arabs. And within southern Iraq, you also have these important Shia monuments dedicated to the fallen martyrs, the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad that were martyred by Sunnis, such as Muhammad's cousin Ali and his son Hussein. They, these monuments, they are very important to Shia. They're sites of pilgrimage. Thus, the Iranian state wanted to encourage revolution in southern Iraq. One little problem, the country was ruled by a secular Sunni Arab republic led by Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party. Saddam Hussein himself was a Sunni Muslim who was secular. He was also this very ruthless dictator within Iran. He severely repressed the Shia and Kurdish populations under his rule. He was also someone as well that had dreams of expanding the Iraqi state. One of the things he wanted to do was expand into parts of Iran, particularly its oil-producing region, along what's called the Shat al-Arab in the southwest. So the Iranians during this time period were heavily encouraging the Shia to revolt after 1979. And so what does Saddam decide to do? Well, he decides to invade Iran in 1980. And what happens in the aftermath of this is an 8-year-long war between Iraq and Iran, okay, that is going to lead to the deaths of over 1 million people in the country. Iran is going to try to mobilize Shia in the far south. They're going to form the Council of the Islamic Revolution in southern Iran. They also tried to give resources to the Dawa Party, a Shia Islamist party within southern Iraq. So we get this long and brutal war. And in the process of this war, lots of people died, lots of cities were bombed. And because the Islamic Republic had this common enemy, this is going to create what's called a rally around the flag effect, where many Iranians are going to rally to the side of the ruling government. Even many liberals are going to rally to the side of the government and fight for the states. And hundreds of thousands of young Iranian men are going to be recruited to go off and fight in this war. And over 500,000 Iranians are going to die in the process. So lots of martyrs were created here during the course of the war. And so in political science, a rally around the flag effect, a war with the common enemy can really rally people to the regime. And this is what created a strong dictatorship in Iran because of this. A mixture of many of their opposition going abroad and many of their other opposition supporting the regime because of this war. There's going to be a lot of people that are going to come out and support. In fact, in that book I talked about, Persepolis, that main character in the book, even though she was not an Islamist, she's actually going to support Iran's war with Iraq because of the fact that the Iraqis were bombing Iranian city. So, it creates this kind of rally around the flag effect here. Now, Iran, along with supporting proxies in various parts of the Middle East and supporting proxies in Iraq, they are also as well going to support proxies elsewhere. Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention here. With the Iran-Iraq war, despite 8 years of warfare, no land changed hands. Over 1 million people died. Interestingly enough, with that war, initially Saddam Hussein was actually getting weapons from the United States to fight that war because, of course, Iran became the new enemy. And so you had this long proxy conflict that actually took place there. Anyway, Iran is going to end up opposing not only the United States and the secular republic in Iraq, but it's also going to oppose the Israeli state, right? It's going to start to give funding to groups like Hamas after 1987 and other groups like Islamic Jihad, for example, so radical right-wing Salafist organization. In fact, it's been supporting Hamas since 1987. So we talked about this in a prior lecture here. Now, because Iran as well was an anti-Western in a Shia theocracy, it's also going to be opposed by the conservative Sunni Arab Gulf countries. One, countries like Saudi Arabia are heavily influenced by Salafism and Sunni Islam. And number two, the Arab Gulf monarchies had an alliance with the United States. So they are going to heavily oppose Iran as well. As a consequence, Iran is going to become a deeply isolated country in the Middle East with only a few allies in the region. And so, as a consequence of this, as Iran becomes more isolated, they're going to start to invest a lot of their funding not only into the Revolutionary Guard, but into a weapons program to develop nuclear capacity. So, a nuclear energy program had been developed under the Shah for peaceful energy, but under the theocracy, they're going to start to develop a nuclear weapons program. They have not yet finished completing nuclear weapons, but they are trying to develop them. And in the process, international sanctions have been placed on them. The UN, the Security Council, the five major countries, Russia, China, the United States, Great Britain, and France, they have placed sanctions on Iran because of the nuclear weapons program. And on top of that as well, the United States and Israel have made efforts to stop the development of a program within Iran. In fact, the Israelis have made efforts to sabotage nuclear facilities in the country. Now, because of all of this activity, because of the growth in the armed forces in Iran, because of the support of these proxy allies abroad, because of the sanctions placed on the regime, because of these deadly wars, this has taken a lot of money away from economic development in Iran and shifted it towards the military. And as a consequence, Iran still remains a relatively poor country with a GDP per capita of only about $5,000 per person. And so a lot of those protests I talked about earlier in this lecture have been caused not only due to ideological resistance to the regime, but economic disappointment with it as well. In fact, this regime has not been able to spend as much as it's wanted to on welfare spending. This has created a lot of problems for the country. And as you can see here, Iran is heavily involved in the region. Since the 1980s, they, for example, helped prop up the Assad regime in Syria. They have been giving funding to various militias in Iraq, such as the Better Organization, Kata'ib Hezbollah, which is a branch of Hezbollah, in Asa'ib al-Haq. They're giving support to Hezbollah in Lebanon, to a group called the Houthi in northern Yemen, since in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. We'll talk about that later, as well as to, you could see Hamas. And so this is a lot of activity in the region. And so thus they've been spending a lot of their resources on things that have not helped with economic developments. Okay, so that does it for my lecture on the Islamic Republic of Iran. If you have any questions down below, feel free to ask. I will see you all next time.